Julia stopped halfway to her house. A light wind ruffled her old coat, as if urging her to walk away. She stood for a long time on the road, in front of the entrance gate, feeling that even the threshold of her own house had become a stranger to her. Her thoughts were occupied only with James, his voice, his eyes, which were increasingly searching for her, as if trying to penetrate to the very depths of her heart. She understood that staying at home meant submitting to these feelings. It was not the kind of love that is born from maternal affection, but something deeper, disturbing, and at the same time frighteningly beautiful. The next morning, Julia made a decision. She went to the train station to buy a ticket to the city where she once spent her youth. She needed solitude and an attempt to find peace where no one knew her. She almost felt relieved as the train carried her away, leaving behind a house filled with memories and feelings she was running from. The city greeted her with a cold rain. Julia walked through the wet streets, briefly remembering how a simple, quiet life had once lived here. It seemed to her that everything seemed so unchanged here: old houses, dark storefronts of closed shops, creaking benches under streetlights. She stopped at the entrance of a small hotel, went inside and asked for the simplest room. Her room was modestly cozy: a small table with a white napkin, a single lamp and a window overlooking a busy street. She stood at the window, watching the passers-by hurry home. Julia closed her eyes and allowed herself to cry for the first time in months. She was tormented by thoughts of James, his presence, which she now missed, his voice, which she hoped to forget. But memory was like a river that carries images, and with each new day she realized that her escape only makes her love stronger. A few days have passed. Julia tried to distract herself by walking through parks and narrow streets, but loneliness made her heart even heavier. One evening, walking into a small bar on the corner of the street, she accidentally heard a familiar voice. It was James. He was sitting at the counter, his gaze focused on a glass of water, and his face betrayed concern and bitterness. Julia froze, feeling her heart clench with fear and joy at the same time. She didn't know what to do: approach him or stay in the shadows. She slowly sat down at the next table, but couldn't stand it and took a deep breath, attracting his attention.
Mom.
His voice faltered when he saw her.
Do you think I'll just let you go, even if you go to the end of the world?
James, how did you find me?
She could barely utter these words, barely holding back tears.
Do you think you can disappear from my life without explanation? I've been looking for you and I'm not going to let you go. I miss you, Mom. You know I don't need anyone but you.
His words, so simple but heartfelt, made her tremble. She felt that he had come here for a reason, that he was looking for her, as if feeling her pain. However, she knew that these words only increased her anguish.
James, understand, I need this distance. You shouldn't have come here. You have to build your life. You have the whole future ahead of you, and I.
The whole future? What is the future? I want you to be there for me. Understand, I can't find a place for myself. I've tried to live without you, but it's impossible. You're all I have.
Julia noticed how his eyes turned dark with inner pain. He really wasn't going to back down. His love, his affection, was as strong as her own feelings. She knew that the longer they were together, the harder it would be to break their bond.
James, I understand that it's hard for you. But sometimes the best way to be with someone you love is to give them freedom. You can't depend on me all your life.
You sound like you don't feel the same way. Am I wrong, Mom? Aren't you running away from your feelings?
These words took her by surprise. He knew. He had guessed for a long time, and now all she had to do was either deny it or admit it. A storm of emotions flared up inside her, and her voice trembled.
Yes, James, I'm afraid of these feelings. I'm afraid we're violating something sacred. Understand, it's not easy for me. I'm leaving to save both of us.
You're leaving to escape the truth that we both know. You are my family, my only close person, and nothing can change that. If you need time, I'm willing to wait, but don't ask me to pretend that we're strangers.
Julia couldn't stand it. Her hand went to his face. Her fingers gently slid over his cheek, and she saw the sadness mixed with hope reflected in his eyes. They stared at each other for a long time without saying a word. Everything she was trying to hide stood between them like an invisible wall. But at that moment she realized that she could no longer deny what had already become a part of her life. Suddenly, the door of the bar flew open, and a cold wind swept through the room, as if diluting the tension between them. Julia quickly took her hand away, and they both seemed to wake up from an obsession.
I will stay in this city, Mom. No matter how much you leave, I'll be there for you. I can't help it.
He left her at a loss, feeling that nothing depended on him now. She watched him leave the bar, leaving her alone, but something inside her told her that their bond was now impossible to break. A few days have passed. Julia decided to try to come to terms with herself and invited James to meet in an old park on the outskirts of the city. The park, overgrown and secluded, had been familiar to her since her youth. She found a place on an old wooden bench and anxiously awaited his arrival. James appeared in silence, but his look indicated that he was ready to listen to her. They sat side by side for a long time, not daring to start a conversation, but finally Julia spoke.
You're probably right. Maybe I should have been honest. I'm not afraid of what people will think, but that it will destroy everything we have.
We have love, Mom. And I'm willing to go through anything if it means being with you. Understand, I'm not asking anything from you except honesty.
Love. Do you really think that's possible? That we can just live by pretending that nothing out of the ordinary is happening?
I don't know, Mom. But I want to be there. I am ready for this, even if the whole world is against us.
Her heart skipped a beat, and at that moment she realized that maybe she should try too. She hugged him, and they stood like that, among the trees, while evening slowly fell around them. Julia realized that this path would not be easy, but now they both knew that they were ready to walk it together. James discreetly closed the door of the old library behind him when it was already getting dark outside the window. Here, among ancient, almost forgotten books and the musty smell of old paper, he felt himself in a world far from all his worries and torments. But no matter how much he wandered between the bookshelves, he did not find answers to his questions. Picking up a random volume from the table, he opened it in the middle and saw poems about love and separation. They seemed to be read aloud by the very air, making his heart ache at the thought of Julia. The pain that followed him everywhere soon led him to a desperate decision. He needed clarity, but he knew he couldn't find it here, among the dusty lines and pages. He needed not only confidence, but also determination. James took his things and went out into the cold evening air. He knew where he needed to go to finally put everything in its place. A few hours passed, and James, gathering his thoughts, decided to go to the house of their old acquaintance Molly, a woman with piercing eyes and a shrewd mind, who had always been something of an old friend to Julia. He was embarrassed that he was disturbing her peace at such a late hour, but it was already impossible to tolerate his doubts. Molly lived in an old house by the lake, surrounded by sprawling trees. After climbing up the narrow path to her house, James knocked on the door. After a minute surprised but welcoming, she opened the door and invited him inside.
James, something happened? You look so pale, like you've seen a ghost.
Molly, I need your help. I feel like my life is ruined because of feelings I can't handle. You understand Julia better than anyone else, don't you? Perhaps you can understand me too.
Molly looked him over carefully, as if trying to discern something beneath the surface of his torment that he himself had not yet realized. She invited him to come into the living room and, offering tea, sat down opposite.
What's bothering you so much, Julia? Right.
Yes, it is. She left trying to give me freedom, but all I feel is emptiness. Every day seems meaningless to me without her voice, her presence next to me.
Molly sipped her tea quietly, her eyes staring off into the distance, as if she understood this feeling much better than she would like to admit.
You know, James, your feelings are not as strange as you think. I have witnessed your connection for many years. It is stronger than simple maternal love, and this is obvious. But be careful. What you are feeling now may seem like illusory happiness, but it can become your pain.
I understand, but how can I betray myself, Molly? How can I deny my feelings? For me, the whole world revolves around Julia, and no norms, no rules can change what is happening inside me.
If you really feel so strongly, then it's not just love for you anymore, but maybe fate. But think about Julia. Her heart is breaking. She is afraid that your connection will destroy what she has been building for many years. If you really love her, maybe you should try to understand her worries.
Molly's words made James think. He got up and walked around the room, looking at the old photographs hanging on the walls, remembering how his life had always been connected with Julia in one way or another. But he also knew that he couldn't back down. That was the whole point of his decision.
Molly, I do not know what to do. On the one hand, I can't back down. I know it would be a betrayal for me and for her. But on the other hand, I can see how hard it is for her. She is tormented by the fact that her feelings for her son are not what they should be. How can I convince her that our feelings are real?
Molly paused, as if weighing her answer, and finally nodded, as if deciding that his doubts deserved the truth.
Go to her, James. Sometimes the only way to find out the truth is not to back down. Maybe Julia is waiting for you to prove your loyalty. You have to show that these are not just feelings, that you are ready to make a choice, no matter how difficult it may be.
Listening to her, James felt his calm return. He knew that the upcoming conversation could be a test for him, but his decision was firm. He would no longer hide from his feelings and let Julia see the truth, whatever it was. Early in the morning, under the soft sound of the surf, James drove up to Julia's old house. It was quiet and peaceful all around. The trees rustled softly, as if they were guarding her peace. Julia had already returned from her seclusion, but as soon as she opened the door and saw him, her face reflected a mixture of surprise and alarm. She silently invited him in, and he felt the tension between them become almost palpable.
You came. How did you find me?
It doesn't matter, Mom. I came to talk to you. I couldn't go on living without knowing how I really felt. I've been thinking about us, and I know it's not just a temporary feeling. It's something much bigger.
She looked away, as if distancing herself from his words, but he noticed that her hands were shaking slightly.
James, I was trying to give you freedom so that you could find your place. You should be building your life, not tearing it apart because of me.
Mom, you don't understand. For me, there is no life without you. I tried to imagine the future, but it seems empty without your presence. I don't just want to be with you, I'm willing to do anything to prove it to you.
Her eyes filled with tears, and she sighed, as if torn between her heart and her mind.
You don't understand what you're saying. This path can bring us a lot of pain, James. People will never accept how you feel, they will judge us. I'm afraid for you, for how this will affect your life.
I don't care what people think. This is my life, and only I can decide who I want to be with. I beg you, Mom, let me choose my own path.
She looked at him as if rediscovering him for herself. His determination and sincerity touched her heart, and although fear and pain were with her, she began to see that his love was real and could not be explained.
I do not know, James. I need time. I'm not sure I can accept it. For me, it's not just feelings, it's like a whirlwind that takes me somewhere where I can't stay the same.
Take any time, Mom, but know that I will not back down. I cannot. My love for you is greater than anything in the world, and it will not disappear no matter how much time passes. Even if we have to go through condemnation and pain, I'm ready if you're around.
These words shattered all her doubts, leaving her with a choice she had been avoiding for years. Julia closed her eyes, as if succumbing to this feeling, and after a moment, she reached out and touched his face.
You've been with me all this time, and I've always been afraid that one day you'd leave. But if you're really ready, I won't be able to reject you.
At that moment, there was not only understanding between them, but also a promise. The promise they made to each other in silence, preparing to walk the path that would change their lives forever. Now there was no place for fear and doubt in their world. On a night shrouded in thick fog, Julia realized that her decision to stay with James might have been hasty. Although her heart cried out to him and longed for his presence, logic and fear put pressure on her. Her inner conflict was growing, and no matter how hard she tried to get used to this feeling, it became more and more suffocating. Every new day spent with him filled her with bittersweet happiness, but as soon as she was alone, all her doubts flared up with renewed vigor, giving her no peace. The morning came when Julia, feeling exhausted from the constant internal struggle, decided that she had to leave again. She couldn't bring herself to tell James the truth. She was afraid that if she explained her feelings and doubts again, their relationship would turn into an endless toss between hope and fear. Therefore, before dawn, while the house was still dozing in the early morning silence, she packed her bag and left a short note on the table and left. At first, she just walked, enjoying the rare feeling of peace that came after she made a decision. Her footsteps echoed in the cool morning air, and the city, which had not yet woken up, seemed to her like something magical, as if transported to a world where time had stopped. By dawn, she was already on the bus, which took her many kilometers away from home, from James, from everything that connected her with that life in which every moment became unbearable torture. Julia was heading to a small town near the mountains, where her old friend once lived. She hoped that there she could find at least a temporary refuge from her thoughts and calm her heart. But her escape, as she soon realized, did not solve anything. She spent several days in this tiny town, wandering through the woods, listening to the silence, hoping that nature and loneliness would give her peace. But as soon as she closed her eyes, memories began to haunt her: his look, his smile, everything that made her heart beat faster. She tried to imagine her life without him, but instead of relief, she felt an emptiness engulf her. It's been a few weeks. Julia decided to settle in a small hut on the outskirts of the forest, away from the noise of the city and casual meetings. Her days turned into lonely rituals: morning walks, conversations with the forest, sunsets watched from a hill where she felt part of nature. But not a single activity, not a single thought could restore her sense of wholeness. Her inner self seemed to have ruptured, leaving her with an empty, painful feeling. But one night, when a strong wind swept through the forest and thunder tore through the sky, a new wave of panic swept over her. She suddenly realized that by leaving James, she had betrayed him and her feelings. This realization was like a blow that pierced her to the depths of her soul. She realized that her love for him was something she would never be able to get away from, that she would not be able to stifle this affection with any distance and external peace. When she returned to the city, she began to relive everything that connected her with James. Every memory of his warmth, of his words, of his support and love burned through her heart. She realized that even if they couldn't be together, being with him was her destiny, that being with him was something beyond her strength and fears. However, when she arrived at their house, she saw that the door was open and silence reigned inside. James didn't meet her, and that silence made her heart sink. She realized that her action could hurt him, that he might never forgive her for running away like that. But she was willing to accept his anger, his disappointment, just to see him again and understand that there really was something special between them. It was several hours before James returned home. He hadn't expected to see her, and when their gazes met, there were so many emotions reflected in his eyes: pain, joy, bitterness, and something else that she couldn't identify. They stood in silence for a long time until they realized that words would not help. Their connection, their story, it was not just love, it was a deep, inexplicable unity of souls. They could be silent, but they understood each other, as if their hearts were speaking for them. From that moment on, their relationship took on a new meaning. They began to realize that they could no longer hide behind formal words and roles. For the first time, they felt real, naked in front of each other, and this feeling did not frighten them, but on the contrary, brought a strange feeling of relief. Julia knew that their relationship had crossed all the boundaries of the usual, and now she could no longer deny that her love for James had nothing to do with maternal affection. She loved him as a man, as a friend, as her closest person, and this love was as natural as her breathing. Their lives had changed in every movement, in every look, even in silence. Their passion, their affection, their unconditional acceptance of each other was visible. Julia understood that she could no longer fight her feelings, that her flight was useless, because love would always remain with her, as a part of herself. But although their lives had found a strange balance, she was plagued by new fears. She understood that society would not accept their love, that their relationship would be condemned. She imagined how others would turn away from them, how their loved ones would not be able to understand what they shared. This fear tormented her like a nightmare, and she knew that their future would not be so simple. In an attempt to gain confidence, they began to change the situation, as if trying to find a place where no one would judge them. Julia and James moved to a small town on the coast, where no one knew them, and where they could just be themselves without explaining their feelings to anyone. Their house by the sea became a refuge for them, where they could enjoy each other without thinking about looks and judgments. However, as time passed, they realized that they could not hide forever. Their love became the meaning of life for them, but this secrecy turned into a heavy burden. Julia began to notice how her anxiety reflected on James, how his joy faded every time they were forced to pretend in front of neighbors, in front of acquaintances. She felt that this double life was depriving them of the happiness they deserved, and understood that hiding forever meant not living life fully. The realization of their love as a force beyond limitations and norms brought Julia and James a sense of inner freedom, but soon it was replaced by something more disturbing. At first, their days seemed filled with light and harmony. They found joy in simple things, whether it was walking by the sea together or reading books by lamplight when the world around them was quiet. Their life in their new place was measured and secluded, as if they existed in a separate universe independent of views and condemnation. But this illusion of security was fragile, and every day Julia felt more and more shaky. Their secret, their love, was something precious, but that was also their vulnerability. Julia began to realize that the fear of being exposed was growing in her heart like a heavy burden. She could no longer enjoy their happy solitude so calmly. On the contrary, every glance from an outsider, every whisper behind her back seemed to her a threat. This caused her to distance herself more and more, which caused James to worry as well. She began to avoid public places, doing everything to reduce the likelihood of revealing their relationship, even if it meant isolation. But the more she longed for peace, the more she realized that fear had become an integral part of her life. Admitting her feelings for James was such a decisive step that she did not immediately realize how deeply she would be hurt by the thought of the consequences. She couldn't sleep at night, imagining rage and condemnation raining down on both of them. Images of friends and relatives who had turned away from them, not understanding the depth or purity of their connection, were drawn in her head. She was tormented by the thought that her children, learning about her relationship with James, would not want to see her anymore, that she would lose their trust forever. This feeling suffocated her, turning every new day into an attempt to maintain a balance between love and fear. One day, unable to stand the tension, she decided to leave. Her plan was simple: to leave James, disappear, start all over again with a clean slate. She thought that she would do this for his own good, that her departure would free him from the unbearable burden that this love imposed on both of them. But standing on the threshold, with a suitcase in her hand, she realized that this step would destroy her soul completely. She couldn't leave. Her heart and mind were trapped in this love, which, although it brought pain, was the only real happiness for her. These weeks turned out to be one of the most difficult trials for Julia. The internal conflict became more and more painful, and every new day she forced herself to smile, to try to be strong for James. But her fear of society, of the possible consequences, of the destruction of everything she knew, corroded her from the inside. She understood that it was impossible to hide any longer, and that she and James would have to accept all the pain that this confession would bring to the world. One rainy evening, when Julia was alone with her thoughts again, a man appeared on her doorstep whom she did not expect to see in any way. It was her daughter Cassie. Soaked from the rain, with a tense expression on her face, Cassie stood in front of her mother, and Julia immediately realized that her secret was no longer hidden. How exactly her daughter found out about what existed between her and James, she did not know, but her own reflection in her daughter's eyes made her shrink inwardly. Meeting Cassie was excruciating. Her daughter, a strong, independent woman, could not understand and accept what her mother was hiding. Cassie was a mixture of anger, frustration, and a sense of betrayal. At first, Julia tried to justify herself, to find words that could explain her actions, but she quickly realized that no words could convey the true depth of her feelings. She knew it was impossible to explain her love for James. A feeling that was above social norms, could not be understood by those who looked at her from the outside. Talking to Cassie changed Julia. She realized that she couldn't run anymore. Now her children, friends, everyone she knew will know her secret. But there was also a strange freedom in this understanding, the realization that she no longer needed to pretend. In the evening she told James about what had happened, and in their eyes lit up the understanding that they were facing a choice on which their future depended. Julia and James decided to accept their fate, whatever it was. They realized that they could lose everything. Their environment would turn away from them. Their relationship would be condemned and cursed. But they also understood that to give up this love is to give up yourself. Julia finally let go of her fears and accepted it as part of their journey, which was inextricably linked to pain and rejection of social norms. And although every day brought new difficulties, their bond remained unbreakable, as if the world itself was powerless to break their unity. Time passed, and rumors about Julia and James spread in their circle. Friends, family, colleagues, each of them faced a choice: support them or reject them. Most turned away, and even those who had been close to Julia for many years could not accept her decision. She had lost her reputation, her respect, but despite this, her heart was no longer tormented by doubts. With each passing day, her life with James became a challenge. They remained alone against the whole world, like exiles, but in this solitude they found solace and strength. Their love has become for them not just a feeling, but a vow that cannot be broken, even if it means being left without the support of loved ones. One day Julia realized that her relationship with James had grown into something more than love. It had become their choice, their only true refuge. They decided to start from scratch, leaving behind those who could not accept them. Julia and James moved to another country to start a new life where no one knew their past. In this new world, they found the peace and quiet they craved. Now they could be together without fear, and although their journey was long and difficult, they knew that, despite everything, they had found their place where their love could be free. After Julia and James finally accepted their love, despite the difficult circumstances, their life turned into a test. They realized that every minute they spent together would now be under the gaze of those around them, those who could not understand or forgive their unusual union. Their small world, which they had so carefully guarded, turned out to be fragile and unprotected from the pressure of public condemnation. At first, their lives continued in relative silence. They settled in a small, secluded town where it seemed they could start all over again. However, rumors spread quickly, and soon curious neighbors appeared on their doorstep, trying under the guise of friendliness to understand what really connects these two. Glances, whispers behind their backs, biased attitudes, all this has become a part of their daily lives. Julia saw James struggling to keep their fragile peace and ignore the attacks of others, but over time the tension began to build up. Over time they began to avoid not only communication with neighbors, but also simple things that used to bring them joy. Going to the store, walking through the streets, all this turned into complex maneuvers, so as not to attract attention. They tried to seem like an ordinary couple with nothing to hide, but they managed it with difficulty. Julia became more and more withdrawn, feeling that she could not bear the weight of their secret. But she couldn't leave James and go back to her old life, and this internal contradiction made her even more vulnerable. Soon their lives began to be filled not only with alienation, but also with outright hostility. Their house was covered with insulting words, someone threw stones at the window, and they realized that staying here was no longer unbearable. James offered to leave everything behind, but Julia felt she couldn't run away again. However, one day when they returned home and found their garden trashed, she realized that the world around her would not change. Their choice will be condemned, their lives will remain at risk. They began to look for a way to leave, to find a place again where they could hide from hatred and dislike, but the question that faced them was not only where to settle. Now they were faced with the question of how to live on without destroying each other. Julia began to feel that their secrecy had become an unbearable ordeal for their bond. She saw how James was changing. He became withdrawn, distant, and his smile, which used to light up their world, disappeared. The decision came unexpectedly. They decided to go abroad, to a country where no one knew them. This step seemed desperate to them, but the only possible one. They realized that if they stayed, their love would be destroyed by pressure that they couldn't handle. They chose a place where no one knew their history, did not know about themselves. A country where they could not become victims of someone's prejudices. They chose the coast, where the ocean met the sky, and where they could start life anew, leaving behind all fears and doubts. After a long journey that seemed to them not only a physical displacement, but also a liberation from their past, they finally reached a new place. It was a small house on a hill, surrounded by greenery and covered with vines. The sea stretched out in the distance, and every day, watching the waves, Julia and James felt the weight that they had carried for so long fall from their souls. Here they could be themselves without looking back at other people's gazes, without thinking that someone was watching their every move. The first weeks passed in a blur. They enjoyed the silence, forgetting what it means to be afraid. They were finally able to live fully in this new home, and every moment they spent together reminded them of what they had gone through all the trials for. Their house was filled with light and laughter. Their love became calm like the flow of a river, and they enjoyed this peace, as if their whole life was just a prelude to this moment. Julia found something to do that filled her life with meaning. She took care of the garden around the house, planted flowers and trees that made their secluded world even more beautiful. She immersed herself in her work, and her every day was filled with joy from simple things, from the scent of flowers, from the sound of the wind, from the warmth of the sun's rays. James found inspiration in painting. He began to paint paintings filled with bright colors and deep shades that reflected their complex but beautiful path. These paintings became their personal story, their memory of every day they lived together. However, even in this paradise, their past sometimes reminded them of itself. Julia sometimes found herself expecting to see familiar faces in the distance, or that someone would knock on the door, bringing with them rumors and condemnation. These moments brought her back to their long-standing pain, to the fear of losing James, and each time she felt her heart skip a beat at the thought that their happiness might be disrupted. But seeing how calmly and confidently James continued to live next to her, she found the strength to forget about it. Over time, their lives began to take on a new, deep meaning. Julia realized that their love had become something more than just a connection between two people. They have been through all the trials, but this struggle has made them stronger. They became not just partners for each other, but also support, a source of inspiration. They became one. Their house on the hill became for them not just a refuge, but a place where they could feel free and protected. Time passed, and their lives were filled with amazing moments, walks along the shore together, endless conversations under the stars, long winter evenings by the fireplace, when they were covered with a warm blanket, immersed in reading and silence. Every day they realized that their love was now their world, their meaning, their everything. They knew that every moment they spent together was the result of their choice, their sacrifice, their strength. Sometimes it seemed to them that no one would ever find them in this new place, that their home will forever remain their secret, their private universe, where no one but themselves has access. From time to time they would hear news about those who remained in the past, but each time it would only bring a slight smile to their faces. They were free, and that freedom now belonged only to them. Several years have passed, and unexpected changes have taken place in their lives. Julia and James began to welcome people into their home: tourists, writers, artists, those who were looking for inspiration and peace. Their house has become more than just a place of solitude. It became a place where people came for healing, and they began to support them as best they could. Julia and James knew that their path was unusual, but it allowed them to better understand those who were suffering, who were looking for their place, who needed support. Their lives have found an amazing balance. They were happy together, and at the same time their home became a place for others who needed peace. In this new place, far from everything that once seemed important, they found their true calling. The house on the hill, Julia and James' cozy hideout, eventually turned into a place of attraction for people looking for peace, meaning, or just a short refuge from their own fears. Each new guest brought with them a special atmosphere and left a piece of himself in their house. Julia and James have learned to find joy in these fleeting encounters. Their guests were mostly strangers, but with each new face, each new story, they were strengthened in the idea that they no longer had to hide. It had been several years since they had left their past behind, and Julia increasingly noticed that time spent away from everyone she knew had changed her. In the past, she had her own circle of friends, familiar places, and a simple, understandable life, but now she was surrounded by strangers, waves, and silence. It was this silence, which had once been frightening, that now became a source of comfort to her. She even found a special beauty in it, like in old letters or half-forgotten memories. However, the peace they were finding turned out to be illusory. One late evening, when a storm was raging outside the windows, there was a knock at their door. Julia, not expecting anyone, was surprised, but she opened the door and saw a figure that gave her a strange feeling, as if a ghost from the past stood in front of her. He was an old acquaintance connected with her former life, a man from whom she did not expect to hear at least something about herself. He came with news that woke up an old pain. It seemed as if her whole former life had suddenly come closer, reminding her of what she had tried so hard to forget. Old friends, relatives, whom Julia had not seen for a long time, conveyed their emotions, their disappointment and bitterness to this person. Someone else's condemnation, which had once caused her so much pain, now sounded like a distant echo, but she felt her heart begin to ache again. She was overtaken by the realization that her past would never completely leave her. The words conveyed by this man revived old doubts in her. She remembered her children who refused to accept her choice, and this memory tormented her. Julia couldn't sleep that night. She recalled the years when her family was the center of her world, when she gave all of herself to her children and home. Her eldest son, her daughters, they all turned away from her, not realizing that a real revolution had happened in her heart. During the long years she had been away from them, she had come to terms with the idea that their relationship would not be the same, but now all her wounds had reopened. She wondered if her happiness was worth going through all this way, through all the losses, through all the broken connections. Her love for James remained unchanged, but that night she couldn't shake the feeling of loss. The next day, when the storm subsided, Julia went to the ocean. She walked on the wet sand, feeling the water touching her feet, and felt the inner storm gradually subside. It seemed to her that the ocean was absorbing her pain, her fears and doubts. Looking at the vast expanses of water, she began to realize that the time spent trying to forget something or get away from something was in vain. Her past will always be with her, as an integral part of herself. But that doesn't stop her from continuing on her way. Returning home, Julia felt that something important had happened to her. Now her past has ceased to be a threat, it has become the basis for a new awareness. She accepted her mistakes and the bitterness of her losses, realizing that all this only strengthened her. James met her on the doorstep, and when she looked into his eyes, she realized that they had both found peace. Their love withstood the test of time and suffering, and a new life was for them a well-deserved reward for the path they had traveled. After this inner transformation, their lives gained new depth and maturity. They were no longer afraid of the shadow of the past and managed to find solace and inspiration in what they had experienced. Julia and James did not look like a typical couple. Their lives were different from the lives of those around them, but their union became stronger, and they found meaning in every moment they spent together. Their love was like the sea, changeable, deep and eternal. There were even more guests in their house. People, in search of inner peace and solitude, found solace in their stories. They, without realizing it, became a kind of guides for those who were looking for answers to questions about themselves, about life and about love. And although they did not share their personal story, its echoes were heard in their every act, in every comforting word spoken for their guests. Julia and James became like guardians of the inner world of those who needed peace and inspiration. Their house has become a symbol not only of love, but also of forgiveness, acceptance and inner liberation. Julia and James began to see something more in their lives than just their union. They saw that they could help others, that their path could become a source of strength and inspiration for those who had gone through suffering and internal contradictions. Their story didn't need words, it was written in their eyes, in their touches, and in the looks they exchanged as they passed each other. Over the years, their home has become a place of attraction for people looking not only for peace, but also for answers to their questions. There was an atmosphere of acceptance in this house. There was no condemnation or prejudice. The guests came and went, and each time Julia and James felt that their own lives were taking on a deeper meaning. Their union, which had endured so much pain, turned into something more. It became a quiet haven for those who got lost on their way. Years passed, and their house continued to live, filled with the stories and lives of those who had been here. Time seemed to slow down, giving them the peace and happiness they had been seeking for so long. Now they understood that their love had taken on a new form. It had ceased to be just their personal feeling and had become a symbol of acceptance and strength for others. Their story, full of loss and pain, made sense when they realized that even the most difficult trials can lead to something bright. Now their days flowed steadily and calmly. They no longer worried about the past or made plans for the future. They lived in the present, realizing that every moment is their precious treasure, that every day is part of their path, which was more important to them than any achievements. Their love became that quiet, but powerful source of light that illuminated their home and the hearts of those who came there. Decades have passed, and this house on the hill has become a symbol not only of love and peace, but also of life itself in all its manifestations. Julia and James, who stepped over their fears and doubts, created their own world, which became their best legacy. And when the day comes when their story will remain only in memories, their home and their love will continue to live, as a reminder that true acceptance and love are able to overcome any obstacles and keep the light in the most difficult trials.